And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 35 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. Okay, guys, tonight, I haven't done this series in a while. I want to pick back up here. And tonight, this part on this series inspired by American historian Victor Davis Hanson, who talks a lot about World War II and some of the issues he's talked about, some fundamental disagreements I may have with Victor. I think Victor's a fine gentleman, respectful. But some points that I'd like to contradict in some ways, and that is the issue of Italian colonization. Um, my resource tonight that I'll be using primarily is Luigi Villari. Probably also refer back to a little bit of Nicholas Farrell as well too. Of course, Luigi Villari with the book Italian Foreign Policy under Mussolini. Farrell, as you guys know, Mussolini: A New Life. But I think the important book here is the Villari book, right? Uh, Luigi Villari was an Italian diplomat started in 1906. He worked for the Mussolini regime and he traveled back and forth from England and America. And he decided to write this book in 1956 after the war, as it was clear that the Allied victory and the interpretation of the war, well, it was a little bit off from his perspective. He was going to try and give the Italian side of the story and what the Italians were thinking in terms of, the narrative of foreign policy under the fascist regime in Italy. And so he presents that history with a little bit more nuance. And tonight, talking about Italian emigration and Italian colonization, both which are very closely interrelated. Now, emigration, not immigration, emigration is where you leave your home country and you go to another country to live, and you live there as a foreigner, and hopefully with the idea of becoming a citizen there. Immigration is, of course, when foreigners come to your country in hopes that they live there. We're going to be talking about immigration, the Italians that left because of some systemic problems, particularly economic problems that Italy was having, even before Mussolini got into power in 1922. And as a result of that immigration, we have to deal with colonization because it's all really closely interrelated. Oftentimes, what you get from the classical liberal slash communist side of the historical narrative, which defines World War II as the good war, you get this general idea that the aggressive nature of the Axis powers was one simply of conquest, right? Of power. We'll try and work through that. I think what we have to remember too here before we get started on this is, you know, colonization, especially, it just depends on what perspective you want to take. Because what happens with these classical liberal historians is they will look at certain events that happened in the midst of World War II. For example, of course, the Japanese invading China, the Germans going east and conquering its neighbors, and of course the Italians going into Greece and places like Libya, Somaliland, and Ethiopia. Say, see, they were the aggressors, while the Allied powers were simply fighting the good war in an attempt to, stop the evil nature of the Axis regimes. And while there may be some truth to that, there's also some nuance to that as well too. And it just depends how you want to look at colonization. The first thing what you have to remember is the one thing that all the Axis powers had in common was that they were not empire nations. They did not have a whole lot of natural resources. And in the case of Italy and Germany, there were newer nations who were actually late to the party on colonization, which set them backwards in a way. Again, in a post-industrial world where you don't have a lot of land, you don't have resources on your land, how do you compete with these global empires, right? Of course, we have the British Empire, which was known as the empire around the world where the sun never sets. The French had their empire all over the world, including lots of nations in Africa. You had the Russian Empire, or should I say, the Russian geographical map. And while the Russians did not venture all over the world, we all know they are by far the largest landmass in the world with all the natural resources you would ever need on their own territory. And which, in fact, was an empire in its own right. And then you have the American Empire, right? And the American Empire, while we think of the post-World War II global hegemony that we've established, but that global empire was really spreading throughout all of the 19th century. You go from the 12 colonies all the way out west, which is a conquest of that territory, pushing off the natives, cutting deals with Catholic nations like France with the Louisiana Purchase, and eventually going out west, to California and all of really the North American territory, which becomes eventually the United States of America. Of course, we have the Spanish American War, which is an attempt of the American government to take, again, colonies, particularly in Cuba and the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, Alaska. This is all of the American empire building even before we really get to World War II and what will come afterwards. And again, that global hegemon that America built as the world superpower after World War II. And so when you have a situation, for example, the Italians, that was a very late forming nation in the 1860s, they were late to the party on colonization. And when you take the fact that it was a smaller nation with or smaller amounts of natural resources, this complicates things in a post-industrial world where you're trying to compete with these four other global empires that can tend to control the narrative, but also control resources and sort of the globalization process that was starting to happen by the 1920s and 30s. Mix in their global communism now that's pushing you from the east. You got a usury capitalist system from sort of the Anglo West. And these nations, well, they're behind the eight ball in many ways. At least that's how the Italians saw it, right? And here, Luigi Villari, in his book, Italian Foreign Policy under Mussolini, tries to explain some of this, what the circumstances were in Italy. And so I guess we will start with the emigration issue. And why the emigration issue is important is because Italy was losing people because of the struggles that it had in economic terms. And this is before Mussolini got into power. Italy, again, is a nation that is about 119,000 square miles. It had a population that was growing from 1861 all the way up in till 1931. The population grew. Let's see here, from 41 up to 41 million, right? I think it started in 1860 in the 26 million range, and by the time you get to 31, excuse me, you have 41 million citizens. But already we have tons and tons of Italian citizens leaving for other nations, immigrating out, particularly to America. As we know, America needed an underclass to help build the foundations of the nations, particularly the subway systems and all the social functions that America needed built. They brought in Catholic immigrations for that. South America, and so something like I think a peak of 700,000 Italians were leaving Italy a year for about 20, 30 years there, which became a problem because you're losing your best and your brightest, your hardest workers, your most ingenuous workers. And what happens to a nation that has a lot of its citizens leave for greener pastures is you lose your best people. And who stays behind are those people that are generally weaker and sicker. And it becomes a bigger problem for the nation. It's a sign of weakness. And this is what Italy faced, is that you didn't have a whole lot of natural resources, right? Steel, oil, coal was virtually non-existent or very little of it. Copper was non-existent, they say. And so when you don't have the natural resources, one, you're already behind in economic terms, but even more so, you're not creating that job base that people need. Italy was a very agrarian nation, right? Fishing nation, but it just could never establish that workforce to keep people in Italy, at least up until the fascist regime came into power. And really, even after the fascist regime came into power, you still had the issue of immigration, of Italians leaving. And so without the jobs, the steady pays, things of that nature, people left. Now, what's fascinating about this to me is how the fascist government tried to deal with this. Because here's the issue that you had. For Mussolini, he thought immigration, but not only immigration, but dying populations was a sign of weakness of a nation. And so his attitude toward immigration was, okay, we can't stop it. We understand that people want to earn a better living. We're trying to get our act together here as he assumed power in 1922. Um, we don't like it. We hate it. Our best and brightest are leaving. But whatever it is they do when they go overseas, we hope that they remember us and we hope that they represent us well overseas. He realized there's a great disconnection when Italians leave or any immigrant leaves to go live in another nation. But he said, represent us well. There was some remittances sent back to Italy by Italians. You know, when you go work in another nation, you send the money back to your home country. But that died off after a while, especially um, as immigrants assimilate to new nations, those that money, those remittances start to slow down quite a bit. There was some of that helped, but not a whole lot of it. And like I said, it began to die off. The other issue you had was this, is that Italy being a Catholic nation and a growing population, well, um, what do you do with this growing population if you don't have the jobs and you don't have the territory? What Luigi Villari notes is that Italy, while it's a beautiful country, it has lots of fertile land. It also has lots of infertile lands. It has desolate mountains. It has lots of marshes and swamp lands and things of that nature. And one of the basic problems that Italy faced was starvation, food. It just couldn't grow enough food in Italy. And this is where they began to consider some issues of colonization because a growing nation and a growing empire, if you want to call it that, needs to expand out. I think one of the big testimonies of history is again when nations grow and are prosperous and are fruitful. One of the signs is that they do grow geographically. It's just one of the indications of that. And I think we saw that in America. One of the reasons why America prospered, obviously, they had all the natural resources that a nation like Italy didn't have. But even more so, it grew. It had a vision. It had, manifest destiny, the best, last best hope for mankind. If freedom dies here, we'll suffer through 1,000 years of darkness. There was an end goal, right? A positive a net goal to make America an image of something, prosperous, a greater image to build the nation and to give hopeful citizens of America sort of a prideful ambition to grow the nation, right? The British Empire had that with its colonies. I think British colonization is a little different because their intent was to suck up resources more than anything else. The French had a vision, the Russians, and eventually the Germans had a vision too. In this case, with the Italians here in the Mussolini regime, their issue was, listen, we have growing populations. We're exploding. We can't feed our people. We don't have a lot of natural resources. How do we acquire these things? And certainly colonization became part of that. But of course, the entire world was colonizing at the time, right? The Americans, the British, the French, everybody was doing that. It's how positive growth and strength of a nation and empires, they grew in those times. Um, of course, when you deal with the population boom issue, before Italy really gets into the colonization kind of aspect of foreign policy and trying to fix some of these structural problems in the nation, um, many suggested to the Italians and the Mussolini regime, well, listen, you got too many people, start popping contraception. Put your people on contraception, which of course is the what? That's the Anglo-Protestant answer to everything. And of course, Italy being a Catholic nation, Again, with the fascist regime having a symbiotic relationship with the church, Italy under Mussolini, in large part being a Catholic integralist nation, the contraception issue wasn't going to work. Plus, again, Mussolini saw a nation that is sterile in its growth of people is a weak nation. That was his belief. He believed strong nations grow in population. And of course, in order to do that, you got to be able to feed people. I think we look at sort of the modern parallels of the Anglo-Protestant republics today, where the Protestants have put all their people on contraception, and now we have again dying population rates in the West and all over the world, really, again, under the dictates of American hegemony post World War II. In many large respects, the church and the fascist regime were right about that. But of course, that wasn't popular at the time. The point is, this is a struggle of powers between nations and who's going to win here. The Anglo-Protestants had visions of a worldwide empire, whether it was the British with the British Empire or the Americans now with the American Empire. And then, of course, you had the communist regimes, the Marxist regimes growing out east with their own visions of things over there. Um, I think if we have any true forms of brutal conquest, I think the Marxist regime is a classic example of that. And so they can offset a lot of their uh, cultural issues, social issues, while allowing for contraception and abortion by simply conquering other nations. That's how they solve the problem. And Italy would face this question and these decisions later on. Again, Italy as a newer nation, a development newer nation, um, well, they already saw a world full of empires all around them, and even colonization would be sort of the pick of the bottom of the barrel for the Italians. But there was not going to be any chance that the fascist regime would ever accommodate or settle with the issue of sterilizing the Italian population. It wasn't part of their vision, it wasn't part of their philosophy. And again, it would have caused even greater problems with the church within the nation. So what you have is basically a situation before the fascist regime comes into power. Lots of Italians are just fleeing for, you know, greener grass, right? Greener pastures, right? Not a lot of jobs, not a lot of land. I think probably the other thing that complicated thing is that Italy had an aristocratic class that monopolized a lot of the land. The fascist regime, according to the Nicholas Ferro book, Mussolini New Life, notes that the fascist regime tried some forms of distributism by giving incentives to the wealthy and the aristocratic class to sell their lands to people, to the peasant class, so they could work the land. They gave them incentive like protection from the Marxists who were taking over their lands or destroying their crops or destroying their factories and businesses. They tried some of that. It kind of succeeded, but the Italian population was growing. You were going to need more access to land at that time. And so immigration, again, part of Italy's economic struggles, development of industry because of lack of natural resources, the inability to access land for peasants so they could work the land, and of course, just economic viability in general. And so that leads to the even bigger fundamental question. Okay, so we lack industry, we lack natural resources, we lack land to grow food for our population, and we have a population boom happening. What do we do? Well, the other answer to that is colonization, of course. And this is where we get, mired into, or at least the fascist regime gets mired into the notions of some of its more unpleasant nature, according to many of the classical liberal scholars. Now, as I said earlier, the fascist regime or the Italian regime was late to the colonization process, mainly because the global map of colonization had already been dominated by, again, the British, the French, the Italians, the Dutch as well too. And there was very little left. You had the Italian or the Italo-Turkish War in the early 1900s, which led Italy to acquiring Libya. Then you had the first Italian colony was Erythea. I believe it's pronounced Erythea or Etheria, excuse me. And then you have, of course, in 1936, you have the invasion, and this is the fascist regime invasion of Ethiopia, which I did another cast on, which is a little bit more nuanced. There were circumstances involved there that I touched on in that cast of why Mussolini went into Ethiopia. You could listen to that cast. But then you got another colony called Somaliland, Somaliland, Italy. And Somaliland was, which I believe now is obviously modern Somalia. Somaliland was partitioned after World War One into three parts. You had Italian Somaliland, you had British Somaliland, and you had French Somaliland. After World War One, the Italians, well, let me take that back. The reason why the Italians entered World War One on the Allied side and broke their alliance with the Germans and the Austrians was the promise of acquiring land if they were to win that war. And of course, when you get to the Treaty of Paris after World War One, where the riches and the spoils are being divided, it was the British and the Americans that told the Italians, "F you, you get nothing, nothing." The Italians got a little piece of Germany in South Tyrol, which I don't know. The Italians were warm look on because they were German speaking people, German speaking lands over there. They weren't overly impressed with it. They took it and they governed it well. They treated the German people in that territory very well. Interesting enough, even World War II, as Hitler begins to go through Europe to, take back those German lands. The one thing Hitler never asked for was South Tyrol, because for Hitler, he looked at South Tyrol and Mussolini had treated them very well over there. He didn't ask for it back. But after the Italians stormed off, angry about the from the Treaty of Paris, after lots of huffing and puffing, they gave the Italians a small strip of this very desolate land in Somalia. And they gave them a piece of strip over there to try and appease the Italians. But of course, it was kind of a worthless piece of land, not much natural resources there, and which is what the Italians were looking for. But there was some fertile land there where Italians could go to Somaliland and be farmers at the very least. It did give them some more exposure to land. And I'm sure, obviously, new land that wasn't already monopolized by aristocrats, it worked for whatever it was. And so Somaliland was an Italian colony. But again, not a whole lot of natural resources. And this leads us again to the issue of, what was Italian colonization? Libya was very difficult over there because uh, you had lots of jihadis over there. But again, these are all in northern Africa for the most part. It's not the most fertile land. Okay. And it's the same situation over and over with the Italians. Is they've gotten these little pieces of land along the coast. Sure, you got access to the waters and to the shipping ways, but not much in terms of fertility and natural resources. So they're forced to manage sort of these low-end colonies in Italy. But still, it did resolve a lot of their problems, whether it was Libya, whether it was Somaliland, whether eventually it was Ethiopia, Eritrea, and of course, Tunisia kind of went back and forth between the Italians and the French over there. It was always a battle. But what we have to remember is that, whenever the Italians got any of this, there was an inherent, what's the word I'm looking for here? An inherent right that the British and the French always felt they had to Africa because they conquered the vast majority of it, right? Um, they say that if you started at the very top tip of Northern Africa and walked down all the way down the continent to South Africa, you would never leave a British or French colonial land. You never leave it. That's how much they owned of it. So when the Italians got in the business of colonialization to try and feed their people, this irritated the colonial powers. They thought they had a right to that. They had, and so when the Italians started dipping into this, you get all these conflictions in Northern Africa, and of course that leads eventually to World War II and the North and the African front of the war, the North and the East African front of the war. And this is where I think a lot of things are misinterpreted by classical liberal historians. I mean, if you want to make the case that the fascist regime was looking to, in a tyrannical sense, to conquest land and territory, you could see it that way. But I think it's more nuanced than that, right? And I think Somaliland is one of those. And again, like I said, I already talked about um, Ethiopia. What that was, that had to do more with a battle between the Italians and the British, because what really broke the balls of the British was the fact that they wanted Ethiopia for themselves, at least the fertile parts of Ethiopia for themselves. And when Mussolini moved in, that's why they got upset. It's later on, of course, by the British press and by these democratic presses defined as an atrocity of Italian invasion and conquest, when in fact it just Mussolini moved in before the British did, and the Western press, which was very powerful, defined the terms and conditions of that war from a Western liberal paradigm, right? Somaliland is the same thing, because what happens in Somaliland as the world breaks out, the war, excuse me, breaks out, is that you have the Italian Somaliland in one corner, and then up against another corner, you have the British Somaliland and French Somaliland. The French had fallen in World War II when the Italians decided to invade British Somaliland. The thing about British Somaliland, though, it was right up against the corridor of the Red Sea, where all the shipping lanes, particularly of oil from the Middle East getting to the British Empire. And when the war broke out, Mussolini and the Italians wanted to cut that off. And it seems like a strategic advantage, or a strategic, well thought idea. And they did invade Somaliland, Britain, and they pushed the British out temporarily. Eventually, the British, of course, as the war went on, would take it back there. But an idea that is simply deemed as a conquest was really a strategy of war. It's like with Greece. A lot of historians will look at the Italian invasion of Greece, and say, see, this is the tyrannical nature of the Axis powers, and particularly Benito Mussolini, who wanted to build the Roman Empire. And while certainly I think Benito had a vision of making Italy greater again, and he was a Roman himself, there was a strategic advantage and a necessity, I think, for the Italians to go into Greece, and that Greece was a British protectorate. Um, they had a British king, and not only that, they had a big naval base there that was going to cause all kinds of problems for the Italians in the midst of World War II. It's kind of, from a strategic standpoint, kind of understandable why the Italians would go after Greece. After the war, it's defined as, well, one Christian nation attacking another Christian nation, and the atrocities of the aggressive fascist regime. Okay, fine. Yeah, you can, but why aren't those same standards applied to when the British are bombing, Hamburg or Dresden or Rome or other Italian cities, right? Is there only one Christian nation attacking other Christian nations when, the fascist regime does it? Or do we apply that universally to where the Protestant regimes are bombing Catholic cities and capitals and Catholic territories, right? You can't have a double standard in this. And so the Italians made a move on Greece simply because strategically it made sense. Now, I think the argument is from Western liberal historians, when you look at the World War II narrative, what you have effectively is a bunch of Axis powers that are conquering and attacking and starting the war. Maybe. I mean, you could look at it that way. I think there's some truth to that. Obviously, the things that Germany did, Hitler did, what the Japanese did, were pretty rough. I'm not gonna lie to you. Even Mussolini barely complained the way the Germans treated when they were invading Operation Barbarossa to different people, different lands. There's no doubt about that. But I think what you have to remember here is, because the Americans, the British, the French, and the Russians already had their empires, they didn't need to be aggressive. They didn't need to go into other areas. They already had their established empires. It was the Axis powers that lacked resources and land and things they needed. Remember, the Americans had a four-engine bomber. They go from America, drop its bombs, and turn around and come back home. The Germans, the Italians, didn't have that. Neither did the Japanese. that changes everything in sort of love and war, if you want to call it that. And so the Axis powers had to take a different strategy. Cutting off resources was one of them, and gathering resources was another one. Mussolini said it, this was a war of attrition. And so when you look at it from that perspective, it's not necessarily one of an ill-founded conquest of other nations, as it's pointed out by a lot of the classical liberal historians like Victor David Hanson, but basically war strategy that is necessary for the conditions that you suffer from, right? Or the conditions that you're in during that war. Again, when you look at Italian colonization, at the very least, you know that Italian colonization was different than British and French colonization. Italian colonization was based on the premise that they needed resources, they needed land for their people because they were starving, because they needed to grow. British and French colonization didn't have an immigration problem like the Italians did because they weren't suffering. Theirs was to conquer colonies in order to gather resources to basically take from these colonial nations whatever it is they wanted and bring it back home to them for their riches, their wealth. Two different reasons. Luigi Villari notes this in the book. In other words, the Italians were trying to feed themselves. They had structural problems, they had resource problems, while the British and the French were simply capitalizing on opportune moments to further enrich themselves. And when you look at British colonization, it exactly didn't go down all hunky dory. There was some brutal sort of metrics that the British had to use. Same with the French. Same with the Americans. You look at the Spanish-American War. A lot of people would tell you that was a false flag operation, which the progressives of the American government sort of started that war under dictates of that in order to acquire Cuba, in order to acquire the Philippines and break the back of the Spanish Empire, right? The fighting in the Philippines, for example, was absolutely brutal over there. And people were dying over there. And it was an American conquest of the Philippines. There's no doubt about that. These things tend to happen. Now, circumstances and situations, all that matters as well too. But the point is, I think of it all, and I think what Luigi Villari argues, it's not as black and white as, okay, the Allies were the good guys, the Axis powers were the bad guys, right? Because this is the classical narrative, the good war theory that a lot of classical liberal historians that have colluded with communist historians have given us. I think it's more nuanced than that. It's circumstances and the challenges that every nation faces. Look at the Germans. Germans really didn't colonize anywhere. They liked to stay landlocked. This is why they had a big military, because their concern was, again, post World War I, trying to reacquire the lands of the Prussian Empire or the German Empire that was broken up because of the Versailles Treaty. They stayed landlocked. They went into, different territories that was taken away from them that had entire towns and cities full of German people, right? Austria and Damberg, not Damberg. I forgot the name of the city now in Poland, but that city. In Poland, where it was an entire German city. And so they went east, is where they went, but they stayed on the ground. But for the Italians, they were isolated by water, by the Mediterranean all around them. There was really no land to conquer. I mean, eventually they would go, into the Yugoslavia region. They made Albania a protectorate of theirs, and there's issues there historically with Albania. But the first visit into Albania, let's call it, Albania agreed to take in the Italians because the Italians, while they lack resources, Albania has some of those resources. They came to an agreement that the Italians would go in there and really civilize a desolate land in Albania. They built the roads, the schools, the hospitals, things that the Albanians didn't have at the time. And when you look at other Italian colonies, same thing. They did the same thing in Ethiopia, in Libya, Somaliland, Eritrea. They brought in the schools, the hospitals, because Africa was kind of a backward continent at the time. It wasn't Christianized, and it was backwards and sort of in their native sort of primitive sort of ideas that they lived under. They lacked basic human rights. The Italians brought law and order there, and in many ways, the inhabitants, the indigenous people of those lands were grateful to the Italians, especially the fascist regime, because they did bring order, right? You had lots of tribal wars happening. They were able to stop that, the mass murder of one tribe over another tribe. They brought in, basic functions of Western civilization that they lacked. They civilized those nations. They were very appreciative. The problem was, of course, that again, there was a jealousy and an envy that the British and the French thought that they were entitled to those lands because they were the empires. And of course, they were trying to stop other nations from being empires. And in this case, in Africa, it was the Italians. But the Italians were expanding. Now, in retrospect, this is determined as an aggressive hostility that the fascist regime sort of was out to get their own, right? To conquest. And then maybe, listen, maybe there's some truth to that, right? But there's also real reasons why the fascist regime made the decisions that it did. I think Nicholas Farrell, again, in his book, Mussolini and New Life, explains it best. What governed Mussolini was fear and greed. Fear and greed. Fear of Hitler, but greed in the sense that he wanted a place at the table of power. This is why he made an ill-formed decision to go into France. When Germany attacked France, Italy wasn't ready to go to war. Mussolini wasn't ready to go to war. Their military budget was never increased in the lead up to World War II. They had a peacetime budget, but once the war started, he felt he couldn't stay out of it. And I think he was probably right because of that, but he needed to find a way to keep Italy out of that war. I think, the same can be said when you look at Italian colonization. They needed colonization, but if you have an entitled group that already has the empires, and they're already stronger than you because, when you have greater military power, the British had the best navy in the world. The Americans were developing the best air force in the world. It was always going to become a problem, and nations become entitled in terms of mentality. This is what really got under the skin of the British and the French, particularly the British, the British. And so history is again written in a way where the victors can describe from their point of view. And the British press went to town on the fascist regime. And let's remember too, what Valari notes in the book is that you have anti-fascist sentimentalities where democracy, you know, unlike now, where it's viewed much more skeptically by people, democracy was still viewed as the gold standard, and autocratic regimes were being looked down upon at the time, and so there was clearly a democratic bias against Italy because of the form of government that it chose. Never mind, the Italians were okay with the fascist regime, but as usual, the Protestant Anglo republics presume right their freedoms upon everybody else. In this case, you had a Western liberal press that was against the fascist regime, and they defined the terms and conditions in terms of colonization from a perspective of tyranny, right? Of Italian and fascist tyranny, which, listen, things happen in war. I do acknowledge that, but I think that's an overall unfair assessment because they wouldn't qualify or describe British and French and American colonization in the same way. It's those nations qualify everything again in terms of right and wrong, good and evil. We're the good guys. Everybody else is evil, right? So when the Anglo republics decide to conquest and colonize, it's a good thing, right? Because they're a democracy. They have a constitutional republic. They have enlightenment-based abstractions that allows them to describe themselves as having good standards or motivations, and they're actually good. They make good decisions for these conquered people. Because again, now that more autocratic regimes are described as tyrannical in nature because they don't allow these enlightenment abstractions to be sort of the center of the law and governing philosophy, then that can be determined as the conquest of other nations in terms of Italian colonization as being evil. This is how the game is played historically. And this is why, ever since the end of World War II, um, you know, things have been described in a manner to us in the Western liberal republics that favors that idea, right? The good war, as Victor David Hanson likes to express in his opinion. And I think, listen, Victor's a good guy. I've listened to a lot of him. I think He wants to be fair, but I think he's also biased. His father fought in the war, and he's a historian looking at it from this perspective. He says he has little respect for German and Japanese historical revisionism. Fair enough. I will be the first to acknowledge that the Japanese and the Germans did a lot of things, but from the Italian perspective, I know he's completely wrong there. Um, and so, how we define these things long term, that's not to say that the fascist regime didn't do evil things. It's war. We all do evil things. Well, all nations do evil things in war. I don't know any nation that's done it perfectly. I know the American regime, we've done a lot of questionable things over our history, especially over the past 60, 70 years, the British, the French. And so, how we want to qualify these in the greater contextual understanding is very important. But I think the overall narrative, when we look at this issue, is the fact that liberalism, post enlightenment, is seen as the ultimate good. And anything done within that framework has to be good, no matter how those steps are taken. We find rationale, we find justification for it. Where when we talk about autocratic regimes, particularly fascist regimes that were defined in the 1920s as tyrannical because they were the aggressor and that were anything that they may have thought of or did or acted upon is deemed as evil. This is how history is rewritten. And now we have lots of historical revisionism. We don't have the limited access to history. It's not a history that's fed to us. I said this a long time ago, and that is, listen, when I was growing up in the 80s, we have very limited access to information. It was basically your major broadcasting channels, which were all liberally owned. But even like when you went down to the local library, right, we had a limited selection of choices, usually by far leftist librarians that simply picked out the books that fit the liberal narrative, right? This is how limited we were. For example, I was a history major in college. I never heard of a historian by the name of David Irving. It was very controversial. I get that. But my point is there was other points of view that have been blocked out for a long time in terms of defining history. Here, I'm simply going with the Italian version of history, right? Because they were the conquered, they were the defeated. Liberalism conquered Italy after the war, along with Germany and Japan, of course. And that side was never really allowed to tell the story. Well, Luigi Villari is trying to tell that side of the story, and I'm simply presenting that. Not that everything that Luigi says or the fascist regime was perfect, but simply trying to present some nuance here from the Italian perspective. Italian colonization was vital for the survival of the nation. And it's survival really for most nations, because nations that don't grow, they die. And look at the historical parallel now with Anglo-Republic nations, Anglo-Protestant Republic nations that have done the opposite of what Italy tried to do, and that is to ban contraception and abortion. The Anglo-Protestant republics have embraced abortion and contraception, and now the Anglo republics are all dying off because of infertility, just to name one of the great problems of Western liberalism today. The irony of it all. And the fascist regime and the Catholics nearly understood that this was going to happen. You put people on contraception, you sterilize your population, you sterilize your women. There's going to be consequences to that, because sterilize your population is a sign of weakness. Look where the West is today. We could find these historical comparisons and say, huh, wow, that's interesting, isn't it? Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Italian emigration and Italian colonization. There was a reason for it. It's more than just the good war narrative. There was legitimate reasons for it. Luigi Villari, in his book, Italian Foreign Policy under Mussolini, copyrighted 1956. I suggest you check it out. It's a hard book to find, I will say that. You got to find it used for the most part, but it's out there. I found mine on Amazon. I suggest you check it out. Again, he'll present you more nuance on the fascist regime and everything they were trying to accomplish in 1920s and 30s. I want to thank you for joining me. Once again, part 35 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. This is Frank, sign off. Frank is speaking. Good night, everybody.